Well, good morning, Wendy Moore. It's good morning for me. Good afternoon to you. I'm in Colorado. You're in London. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Dave. Nice to talk to you.
You have written a wonderful book, and No Man's Land is amazing. And of course, stateside, it's No Man's Land. Your title on the continent is Endell Street.
Yes, that's right. Essentially, it's the same book, but we've just got different titles.
Different titles. Now, as you go around Britain and you mention Endell Street, does it feel like people know what that is?
Well, no, not at all. I think one of the reasons I wrote the book was because the story of Endell Street Military Hospital was not known. Endell Street is just a little street in the centre of London. Most people don't know it has any significance at all.
Right. How did you stumble upon this topic? Was it something you always knew, or you found the treasure?
It was sheer serendipity. I'm a medical journalist by background, so that's my interest, and I've taken an interest in medical history in particular. So I've written 4 books already on medical and social history.
Yes.
So I was looking for another book, and I walked into my favourite library, which is the Wellcome Library for the History of Medicine in London.
Right.
And there was a picture on the wall, and it was a picture, an oil painting of women in an operating theatre.
Yes.
So I was immediately interested because even today it would be unusual to find an operating theatre completely staffed by women doctors.
Yes.
And then I learned that this operating theatre was in a hospital in London in the First World War, and the hospital was totally staffed by women. So that I was hooked, and then I just had to find out more about it.
And I believe you're talking about that Francis Dodd painting.
Indeed, yes.
That is just amazing. And of course, it's that research library where you and I met about 5 years ago. You were too kind to let me interview you in preparation of my book. And that's when we became friends. And I've always been a fan of your work.
Thank you so much. And I've actually been to talk to surgeons in America quite a few times about my first book, because it's about a pioneering surgeon who actually taught many of the first American surgeons who set up medical schools in America. So.
Exactly. And of course, you're speaking of the book, The Knife Man, the book about John Hunter, your wonderful book. And you're right. John Hunter himself trained the doctors who would found our first hospital at the University of what is now the University of Pennsylvania. And so John Hunter was legendary, really the first scientific surgeon. And if you're listening to this interview and you haven't read that book, I would actually do the combo purchase. Get The Knife Man and No Man's Land, because that is a wonderful book, richly detailed. I'll back up 1 second. You know, that the reviews of this book have been wonderful. You know, all the important papers have called it meticulously researched, fascinating, timely, crisp, novelistic. It's all those things. And of course, later in this interview, I want to talk to you about some of the interest in turning this into a film or into a series. Because as I read this, I thought, this absolutely belongs on the screen. It just is an incredibly important work, and you've told so well.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So let's set the scene. You start the work in September of 1914, and you know, Americans, our view, and I think mostly Americans will be listening to this interview, our view of what World War I think is a little different than yours. You were like living in it, and just you know, your forefathers and foremothers were all just absolutely surrounded by war. What do you think World War I, the memory of it, what does that mean for Britons?
I suppose most Britons probably think back to World War II. My grandfather fought in World War II. World War I is more of a distant memory, but
Yes.
It was, it's, you know, obviously Britain was involved in the First World War from 1914. America came in much later, 1917, and
yes,
really was not on the front in great force until 1918.
Yes.
So I think for British people, the war really came to them as well, because it was very present on the home front in terms of the amount of hospitals that were set up, the numbers of wounded that were arriving every day by ambulance trains, Zeppelins coming over. I think it's really hard to imagine what that was like, because this isn't very long since the airplanes had been first invented, and then suddenly these huge Zeppelins are coming over, raining down bombs on London. So people were really in the thick of it, and there were fears for a long time that, well, Britain and the Allies would lose the war, but also that Britain could have been invaded. So
right.
it was very real, it was very frightening, very different, but it also did bring these incredible opportunities for women too, for who did all sorts of jobs they'd never done before.
So that's one of the many things I learned in this book. I did not know that there was bombing of London and several of the important British cities during World War I. Of course, we all know about the Great Blitz in World War II.
Yeah.
But that the fact that these lumbering Zeppelins were floating overhead and dropping bombs, and then some of the early biplanes coming and dropping bombs, that was news to me. And then to realize that it was happening so near this hospital. Okay, we'll get to the hospital in a second. So it starts in 1914 in September at Victoria Station. For a brief second, before we talk about who's getting on these trains, remind listeners what it is that the organization of the train stations coming in and out of London. To you, you've lived there for so long, you still live there. Everyone in London knows which train station you have to go go south, to go north, to go west. Can you give us a basic clue of why Endell Street ended up being so centrally located and why that was important to who was coming?
Well, in the First World War, many of the men arrived on ambulance trains, and they came to various stations in London. Most of them were coming from the south coast, so they would end up at Charing Cross Station or Victoria Station, which are the south coast lines. And Endell Street was really smack in the middle. It's right in the middle of London, very close to major railway stations, so close to Charing Cross Station, which is the one I go to most often when I'm going into town, so I know it very well. I know Victoria Station very well. It's a beautiful, great yawning building.
Yes.
So when there were big advances and lots of wounded arriving, they would come into these major railway stations, and then they'd be taken by motor ambulances to the nearest hospitals. So Endell Street was one of the 10 biggest hospitals in the centre of London. It wasn't trivial by any means. It was one of the major military hospitals.
Yes. So with that as a backdrop, because toward the last half of your book is about everyone using those train stations to come into London. But the beginning of the book, you tell it so well. It's immediately riveting. Who is getting on these trains in 1914? Our two heroines are getting on the plane. Tell us who Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson were.
Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson were both women doctors. At that time, it was relatively rare still for women to train in medicine at all. So there were about 1,000 female doctors in the UK.
Yes.
So they had trained as doctors. Flora was experienced as an anaesthetist, and Louisa was really a surgeon. But at the time, women doctors were effectively confined to treating just women and children. So they were not appointed to jobs in mainstream hospitals. They were all done by male doctors. Most medical schools did not allow women, so they trained at a female medical school, and it was taboo for women doctors to treat men even. So they were both very committed. They were life partners too. They were committed to each other, and they really wanted to progress in their field, and were frustrated by that. They'd also, because of these this discrimination, they'd joined the suffragettes, so they were both very active suffragettes.
Yes.
Flora Murray had been Mrs. Pankhurst, own doctor, treated lots of suffragettes who'd been in prison and force-fed. And Louisa, her aunt, was actually leader of the suffragists,
Right.
for the non-militant campaigners for the vote.
Yes.
And she'd been to prison for 4 weeks for
Right.
smashing a window in a suffragette protest.
So these two women, just heroic in their effort. When I went to medical school at the University of Kansas in the early 1990s, I was walking down this long hallway. So University of Kansas, it's the oldest medical school west of the Mississippi. So the the photos of the graduating classes is very, very long. It's well over 100 years, which in America, and you think it's 150 years old, we think it's kind of old. It's laughable to you. But 150 years of medical school graduating classes. And I stopped, I'm a white guy, and I'm looking, and everyone looks exactly like me for the first century. There were no women, there were no Black graduates, there were no Hispanic graduates. And I think the modern listener, the modern reader, almost can't imagine it. It seems insane that there were no women doctors being allowed at these major medical schools 100 years ago in England.
It's incredible. I mean, the first woman on the medical register in the UK, she was British, but she lived in America. So she had got her medical degree in America from Geneva Medical College in New York State, Elizabeth Blackwell. So she was a real pioneer. And it was because of meeting her that Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, so she was Louisa's mother, she became the first woman to train in Britain to actually become a doctor. So their determination is absolutely humbling, I think. But I mean, it's also quite incredible because obviously there were nurses who were treating men, so that was fine. But the argument was that women doctors could not be surgeons in particular because they weren't stable, emotionally stable enough. So women doctors were simply not wanted.
Right. It boggles the mind, and we can't imagine it, especially now, because across the board in every medical school in America now, there are more women than men. I think most graduating classes have about 55, even 60%.
Yeah, that's the same here too. And the medical profession now in Britain, 48% are women, so it's almost equal now.
Right. The tide here in a few years will turn, and there will be more women practicing doctors on the whole. So Louisa Anderson's mother is this pioneer, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the first to qualify, as you mentioned several times in the book. And it appears that Louisa's parents had a good marriage. She grew up loving them, and she was very close with her brother as well.
Her parents encouraged her. They made sure that she had a proper education. She went to a good school, and she wanted to follow in her mother's footsteps.
Right.
So she trained at the London School of Medicine for Women, which was where almost all women doctors in Britain had to train.
Right. So here they form their own medical school. They graduate, and then they're stuck.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So they're not qualified. There's this additional glass ceiling. So not only do they make their own medical school, they graduate, and then they have trouble getting into their own hospitals. So what's their solution, Wendy?
So Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, Louisa's mother, had also founded a hospital which was for women, run by women. So many women doctors worked there. So women doctors had to work in hospitals that were run by women to treat women and children. So Louisa Garrett Anderson, she worked as a surgeon in the hospital, treating women. So she had experience in mainly gynecology and some general surgery, but only on women. And between her and Flora together, they founded their own very small hospital, 7 beds, for children in a very poor part of London. So they had experience in treating women and children. And Flora had experience as an anaesthetist, but only with women and children.
And so these hospitals that are formed, typically, as you just said, are serving impoverished women and children.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not exactly in the fanciest parts of London and around Great Britain and the UK. And so it is mind-boggling to me as an orthopedic surgeon, some viewers may not know this, I'm a surgeon and an author, that they would go in and all of a sudden find themselves treating war injuries after essentially no trauma battle training, none.
Yeah, yeah. So in fact, lots of women doctors, when the war began, they offered their services to the British Army, but the British Army turned them down. And famously, one Scottish woman surgeon, she was sent home and told, "My good lady, go home and sit still." So the army did not want them. So Flora and Louisa, and also some other women, they decided they would still go to war. So basically, Flora and Louisa, they got together themselves, a small unit of women doctors and nurses and some women orderlies, and they took themselves off to Paris, and they ran a hospital there for the French Red Cross in a hotel in Paris. But as you say, they were very inexperienced, dangerously inexperienced. They had no experience of treating men, no experience at all of military surgery, very little experience of surgery in general. Orthopedic surgery, for example, they had hardly any experience of that. But in context, the injuries that the First World War unleashed were unprecedented to all doctors. So no doctors, female or male, had seen before these enormous gaping, ragged wounds and dreadful compound fractures and head injuries. Also the sheer scale of these casualties was completely unknown. So they all had to learn very quickly. So Flora and Louisa ran a hospital with 100 beds in Paris. They were treating
in a hotel.
In a hotel, a brand new hotel, which had actually never opened. So they converted this hotel within 2 days into a 100-bed hospital. And on the second day, the wounded started arriving. So they were coming from the front line about 60 miles away. And Flora and Louisa, they didn't seem to have any doubts. They just went at it. They were running, their operating theatre was in the ladies' lavatory, which they'd converted. And they used a fish kettle as a sterilising unit. And they just got at it, and they learned very quickly. And they were highly successful.
I keep saying heroic. I don't know what other word to use, but the fact
reckless.
That they would make their own uniforms. I love that you made that point, because of course nothing was really official. They just figured we are going to put on pause our suffragette ideas and some of the militancy, and we have to have the right to vote, because of course women in Australia and New Zealand already had the right to vote, but not in the UK. And so they put on pause the rightful demand to have the right to vote. And they said, and they turned the table and they said, we're going to loyally go work for our country, treat these injured men, and make our uniforms. Go ahead.
But they also were quite pragmatic, because they realized that the war was an opportunity.
Yes.
It was a chance. It was the first chance for women doctors to prove that they were as good as men. So they were patriotic. They did want to help their country. But yes, they saw their chance.
Yes, and it was a glorious chance, and they took advantage of it and did incredible work, because here they show up in Paris. The wounded are coming, kind of a ragtag ambulance crew of bringing injured into the very heart of Paris. They're treating them, and they're doing well.
Yes.
So you write about how that here they're up and running. They've made this beautiful hospital. They've made their own quasi-official uniforms. And they're planting flowers. The sheets are crisp and clean. And one of the British officials comes to inspect and he is curmudgeonly, reluctantly has to declare, you're actually doing quite well.
Yes, yeah. So quite a few army officials and, like you say, quasi-military people came to look round because it's a novelty. They were quite hostile initially, but when they looked round and they saw the work that was being done, they were so impressed that they became advocates for the women's work and allies for them. So then they made sure that word came back to the War Office, saying that these women doctors were actually doing really good work.
Yes. So they then moved from Paris, and this crew, or most of the crew, then relocate to get even closer to the action, realizing if we're really going to be busy and make a difference, we got to go. So where did they go, Wendy?
So because the front line was shifting, fewer casualties came into Paris. And they could have gone home, but they wanted to carry on. So they went to, they found another small hotel close to Boulogne on the French coast, which was near to the centre of the action, near the First Battle of Ypres, in fact.
Yes.
And they set up a new hospital there. And then they went to the army in that area and offered to run it as a hospital for the army. And they were accepted. So this became the first hospital run by women that was run under the auspices of the army.
Hugely historic moment. Now, is that structure still there? Is that hotel still there?
It's still there, and I've actually been to visit. I've been to look round. Very lovely owners who live there still, and it's very similar. It's hardly unchanged at all. Hardly changed at all. It's this beautiful old building near close to the sea.
Well, I hope they let you film what must be a movie or a series made for television, whatever it's going to end up being. It's wonderful that some of these locations are still there. You wish the Endell Street was still there and not built over, but hopefully they'll let you film there, because to me it has to happen. The story's too good. So, I love your emphasis. The saying, deeds, not words. And I think it's so incredibly important, because they realized, Murray and Anderson, here's our opportunity, and we're going to stop talking about it, and we're going to stop arguing about it and begging. We're just going to go and make it happen.
Yeah.
Deeds, not words.
Yes,
glorious.
That was the motto of the suffragettes, and they took it as their motto as well, and they very much acted on that.
Yes. So they realized after a while what they needed to do was take a breather, because the work was crushing and exhausting, and Murray and Anderson and everyone along with them, and Murray and Anderson at the time, it's not like they were 28-year-old inexperienced or just vivacious and youthful doctors.
Yes, they were in their early 40s. So
right.
But they were experienced, in terms of they'd had 10 years experience each. So.
Exactly. So they end up coming back to London, and the organization is shifting a bit. Explain that process.
Well, if they were actually invited to a meeting at the War Office in early 1915, and at that point, the medical services had really been completely overwhelmed by casualties so far, so they'd had to really up their game.
Yes.
But they needed huge amounts of more beds, more hospitals in Britain to bring back the wounded from the front. And so Sir Alfred Keogh, who was the head of the Royal Army Medical Corps, so the top doctor in the army, he offered Flora and Louisa the opportunity to set up and run a hospital in the centre of London. And he said they could run a hospital up to 1,000 beds if they wanted. So this was utterly out of the blue. It was, completely unprecedented.
Yes.
But he'd heard of their work from other doctors in France, so he was confident they could do it. but it was a huge gamble. His own colleagues were telling him, this won't work, these women doctors aren't up to it. They predicted that the hospital would not last for 6 months, but he took that chance on them.
What a gamble he took, and to meet with them, with Flora Murray and Louisa Anderson in the War Office. And they then decided there in the Covent Garden area of London to take this workhouse and convert it into a hospital. So tell us what a workhouse is.
So they were given by the War Office this old workhouse building. So this was a leftover from the Victorian age, really, used to house poor people who could not find work, who were destitute, and they developed their hospitals too. So they were places where very poor people were being treated. So in 1914, the War Office had taken over some of these old buildings and turned them into hospitals.
Yes.
So this was one of those former workhouses. It was a very grim, gloomy looking building, 5 stories, very dark inside, full of filth and dirt, around a small courtyard in the middle. So yes. It's the building that Flora and Louisa were given to convert into a hospital. And initially work was going slowly. So typically they decided, okay, we're not happy at the pace of work. So they took over the conversion work themselves and speeded up the men and got them going.
And they converted it on the fly, and just like what happened in Paris and on the coast, before you knew it, here come the patients. So you're in the heart of London. On one hand, it doesn't feel like you're in the middle of battle, but oftentimes on a nightly basis, here in the middle of the night, here come the next groupings of ambulances coming from the train stations with these freshly injured soldiers right off the front. And for a lot of listeners and readers who saw the movie 1917, this was the kind of trench warfare where these soldiers are being brought mangled, burned, gassed, in agony, coming to the Endell Street Hospital. Here are these men, savaged by war, looking around, and every doctor, every nurse, every orderly taking care of them are women.
Yeah, it was quite shocking for some of them to begin with, because they'd arrived at the station, they were taken by ambulance, they'd arrive in this courtyard, possibly dazed and maybe unconscious, and then they would suddenly be surrounded by women. So women nurses, women stretcher bearers, but also women doctors. And apparently some of them were so confused and shocked by this that they thought they'd been sent there to die, because that's the only way they could explain being sent to a military hospital that was in the hands of women.
Right. And then in time, everyone started realizing, you guys are getting great results. This is a wonderful place to be cared for. And it became this reality that who would want to leave? This was the place to be treated.
Yeah. A lot of the opinions changed very quickly. So the men very quickly discovered that they liked the hospital. They would then describe it as the best hospital in London. It was two things, because Flora and Louisa were determined that their hospital should be as professional as any other military hospital. So, the care was superlative, but they also, they wanted it to be as good as a male-run hospital, but also they wanted a woman's touch as well.
Right.
So they went out of their way to make sure that it was very homely and comfortable. So the wards were all bright and cheerful. There were fresh flowers everywhere. The courtyard was turned into this lovely, tranquil garden. They had lots of entertainers coming in. They had a library with 5,000 books. And this was all geared towards helping the men to recover in their minds as well as their bodies.
Right.
So it became a very popular hospital to go to. because they were surrounded by women. That was one thing, and they made a point of choosing attractive women orderlies. That was one of their conditions, because they thought the men liked this. But it was a place where you were nurtured, where it was homely and friendly and comfortable, and there was always something happening. There were so many concerts and plays and sing songs. It was very busy, very active, very lively.
It's just outstanding. It's just an incredible story to think that they were growing and learning, and in particular, from a surgeon's perspective, thinking of Louisa Anderson having to read and assimilate the knowledge and talk to other surgeons and realize, how are we going to treat these patients? How are we going to treat these terrible infections? And in fact, they did alter and change the solutions, as you write about, the better way to treat these infections, and made a huge difference.
Yeah, I suppose in some ways, because they were pioneering, they didn't necessarily feel they had to follow what other male surgeons were doing, and they carved their own path, I think, because they were pioneers in various ways. They were among the first to make sure that X-ray machinery was used, because X-ray machines were not common at the beginning of the war.
Right.
They particularly were fanatical about physiotherapy, which was also in its very early stages. So they made sure that the men had appropriate therapy and occupational therapy. They were taught knitting and sewing to keep them busy and their minds motivated. Right. So I think they very much saw themselves as carving out their own path, really.
So let's talk a little bit about their personal relationship. So here you have Flora Hewitt, Louisa Anderson, the anesthetist, organizer, head of the hospital, and the surgeon together, revolutionizing the care. I mean, a few years before, a woman couldn't find a job to work in a hospital, and now they're running an incredible hospital. So you have all this work going on. Let's talk about their personal relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I think really, in a way, it's a love story as well, because they were living as a married couple. They were partners. They had identical diamond rings. They were totally devoted to each other. And I think running their hospital and proving that it could be a success was a kind of act of love for them. It was a mutual commitment to make sure that it worked. So from the time that they opened Endell Street Hospital, they lived on the site. They lived in the hospital themselves. They were working most hours. They were on call all the time. So they took great care of the staff. So they'd invite staff to dinner, but often they'd have to stop halfway through to go and see a patient who was in pain, or a convoy would arrive and they'd have to look after that. So it was amazingly hard work, and really, I think, difficult as well to keep motivated, but they did that because they really wanted to keep the staff motivated. That was one of the crucial things.
Right.
So they had 180 staff, and apart from, there were about a dozen male helpers initially, and eventually that was reduced to about 8. But all the other staff were women, so there were about 14 other women doctors. Louisa had 6 assistant surgeons, and obviously those changed over time, so there were several dozen women doctors who did work at Endell Street over the years. And most of the work was done by orderlies, really, women orderlies, who were really nursing assistants, clerks, cooks, stretcher bearers, did most of the main work, really.
And as you mentioned in the book, plenty of those orderlies and assistants were from fairly well-to-do families.
Yeah, indeed. Most of the women who worked at Endell Street were middle class or upper class. Most of them had done no work before in their lives, not only no nursing work, but they had led lives of leisure. They would have had servants at home. They lived with their families. They spent most of their time, going from one social engagement to the next.
Right.
But they volunteered, and they very quickly, got to grips with what they had to do.
Yeah, so, to the American viewers who love things like Downton Abbey, it just shocks our mind to see someone of the nobility class being dressed as, and you say valet, don't you? You don't say valet, but to being dressed, it just, I can't imagine that. And the next thing you know, they're changing a bedpan.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so they had never had to do anything for themselves before. They'd had cooks to cook their dinners, maids to wash their clothes, and so forth. And now they were having to dress wounds, empty bedpans, throw out dirty dressings, carry coal. But Louisa and Flora were kind of quite determined that they had these women who they thought, most of them had been to girls' schools. So they thought they were quite stoical, and they kind of saw it as being women of a certain character, who were strong-minded and stoical and
Right.
determined. And they very carefully chose the particular women. So they had interviews where they made sure that the women were kind of up to the job, really.
Right. So just when you think things can't get any worse, with the revolutions that are happening in Russia, you then have the German invasion saying, okay, we don't have to fight there anymore. There's going to be this big push coming in the spring of 1918. And of course, as you describe in the book, there's this pulsation of war. Winter time comes, aggression kind of cools down because they really can't fight.
Mm-hmm.
And then here comes the springtime, this huge 100 days offensive coming from the German forces. And here come more injuries pouring into Endell Street.
Yeah. And this is kind of the make or break time, really, because by 1917, obviously America joined the war, but it wasn't until early 1918 that there were American boots on the soil in significant numbers. So the Germans launched this huge new offensive, trying to get the upper hand before the Americans arrived in large numbers, which they thought would be overwhelming for them.
Yes.
It was. I think by this point things had become really difficult. In Britain, there was rationing of food, so there were food shortages. There were bomb attacks on London. I think the women at Endell Street everywhere were very tired by this point. And in fact, a lot of the staff had become ill or had to give up. So they did recruit some American women to actually come over and work at Endell Street. So at the same time as the Americans were arriving in France to come to the aid of the Allies, these American women came over and arrived at Endell Street to provide reinforcements for them as well.
Yes. And so just when you think you're working hard enough, here comes more bombings, and some of the bombs dropped incredibly close to the Endell Street Hospital.
Yeah. There was one in particular at the beginning of 1918 that fell at the bottom of Endell Street. It was a tragedy because it dropped in a printing works which had been used as an air raid shelter, and there were about 600 people sheltering in the basement of this printing works. And the bomb dropped, and there was a huge inferno. Many people were killed, and many injured as well. And a lot of those casualties actually went to Endell Street to be patched up. Yeah.
Yes. So now we're getting local injuries. So you have the war injuries of people being shuttled all the way, and now the local Londoners being treated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You would think with all of this triumph and all the objective data showing that people had done well, and in fact, a different kind of hospital, as you say, with a woman's touch, who wouldn't want to be treated there? You would think, great, we've solved all our problems. Now women are going to be coming into medical schools in droves, but no.
Yeah. it would have been nice if it had been so simple. It would have been lovely to write a book where Endell Street was this, great pioneering place, and then everything changed. But that didn't happen, because when the war ended, men came back from the war, the male doctors came back from the war, wanted their jobs back, understandably, I think.
Right.
But the women who'd been working in hospitals throughout Britain and at Endell Street, their jobs were taken from them. So the hospitals sacked the women doctors who'd been working there,
Right.
wouldn't refuse to appoint women doctors again. Medical schools closed their doors again to women, and all the women at Endell Street, the women doctors, had to go back to treating women and children again.
Right. Now, the right to vote finally comes, but with conditions. I think you say that only women over the age of 30.
Yes, yeah.
For
So in
goodness
fact,
sakes.
most of the women who helped at Endell Street didn't get the right to vote, because most of the orderlies were younger than that.
Right.
Some of the women doctors did get the right to vote. Yeah.
I remember one of the things that surprised me. So my wife's family, for generations, have all gone to Yale University, one of the
Yeah.
great institutions in America. My father-in-law graduated there in 1960. Still 0 women at Yale in 1960.
Staggering.
It is staggering, because by then, for a long time, Oxford and Cambridge had been admitting women.
But although they were quite late as well.
But obviously very late as well.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
almost doesn't
It
seem
is. It
possible.
is shocking. It's shocking. It shocked me as well to find out how late things had changed, because even the Second World War, women doctors were again allowed into the army. But after that, medical schools gradually allowed women in, but not in equal numbers. So not in equal numbers until the law changed here in 1975.
Right.
The Sex Discrimination Act ensured that women supposedly had equal rights to jobs and so
Right.
forth. So that's when medical schools had to make sure they were allowing women in equal, not necessarily in equal numbers, but at least giving them equal chances.
Right.
But it was still not until the beginning of this century that women were coming into medical schools in the same numbers as men. So
Right.
incredibly late, really. A long, long battle, really.
Incredibly long. And and as a father, my wife and I have 4 kids, 2 sons, 2 daughters, and I think that really changed your perspective as well, thinking about my daughters not having the same rights to go to the same schools. Boggles the mind. And the fact that you say 1975 just doesn't.
Yeah.
And now I've seen it as an orthopedic surgeon. When I started my training in 1995, there were 0 women in my residency program. And I'd go to our big orthopedic academy meetings and see almost no women.
Yeah.
And the numbers
Yes,
just continue to rise.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So things still have a long way to go even today. And in the UK too, women are still underrepresented in surgery
Right.
and in other top specialties. So women are still in lower status jobs, and
Right.
still have difficulty getting equal opportunities.
Right.
So I know lots of women doctors are still very frustrated by
Right.
the
The battle
situation.
continues.
Yeah.
And it's back
Absolutely.
to deeds, not words.
Yeah. Yes.
I liked it that you included that near the very end of the book. Now I'm going to leave. You have to read the book to find out what happens with Anderson and Murray. We're not going to get into that in detail. You have to read the book. But in terms of the process for you as a writer, going to these places, what do you think was among the most magical moments for you? Being in the right place or reading the right letter, what were some of the magic moments?
Well, I think for me, I mean, there were lots of archives and libraries where I looked at papers and letters and diaries, and that's always really fascinating. One of the special moments was going to see this actual uniform. So one of the original uniforms that was worn by one of the women orderlies at Endell Street still survives. So
Oh,
I got to see this uniform. I
is
couldn't
it
touch it
privately
because it's
held
too
or in
professional.
a museum?
It's in the Women's Library, which is now part of the LSE, the London School of Economics Library. So that's where that's held. But I think probably the most significant thing for me was getting in touch with families whose grandmothers had worked at Endell Street and or whose grandfathers had been treated there. And so I managed to contact lots of different families, and they would share with me photographs and memories and letters, and that really made me feel really close to what had happened. In
Yes.
fact, I've got one thing. One of the orderlies, her granddaughter gave me that little bookmark,
Oh, yeah.
which belonged to Nina Last. So she's one of the orderlies in the book. So
Oh,
I
that's
treasure
incredible.
that. That was such a kind thing to do. So I've got to know lots of people who have got connections to Endell Street.
Oh, that's wonderful. When you do your writing, let's talk about your writing in and of itself. You're there in your office. Is this where it happens? Am I
This is
looking at
it.
this? This is it. And do you have a pattern that you write a certain time of day? Do you trade off
I'm
between researching and writing?
Well, I'm pretty disciplined. I think most writers are quite disciplined. You'll know that as well.
Yes.
So I have a normal working day. I'm here at 9, work till 6. Usually I find I get on with writing best in the morning. But if I kind of come to a bit of a standstill, I'll go off and do some more research in the library. So that makes me feel kind of re-energized again.
Right.
But it is hard graft, really. Um, Not as hard as surgery, I'm sure, but it is hard work. Sometimes I do feel like I'm, banging my head on a
Right.
brick wall, but you have to keep going, I think.
It's it's the solid. Andrew Wiley, now one of my agents, has talked about it. It's almost like a writer is a prisoner. You're in solitary confinement,
Yes, yeah.
doing this work all by yourself, drawing your own inspiration. And
Mm,
when you find a lovely story, you just feel
mm,
like you have found a treasure, and you have to share it. So it's this
yeah,
simultaneous urge to share it with the world and
yeah.
communicate it to huge numbers of people, but you're doing it all by yourself.
Yeah, yeah, that is the hardest thing. I think you have to keep motivating yourself, keep reminding yourself why you're doing it, and there are times when it gets hard. But this is the 5th book I've written, so now I think I know this process. It's hard at times, but you have to just keep pressing on, really.
Yes. Well, I have to say, I'm so impressed with the entire work. Such a fan of your writing. This book, I'm going to hold it up here, No Man's Land.
Oh,
Uh,
thank you.
Both the audiobook and the hardcover are just incredible. Thank you for
And I've
giving
got
this. What's
this
that?
is the British one as well, just
Oh
to
yes, yeah, yeah, on the
swing
British side,
purposes.
right? Just an incredible work, and I absolutely there's no way that this won't be seen on the screen, and I just absolutely look forward to that. Well done, Wendy Moore. Good on you, as the Aussies would say. This is incredible, and I can't wait for everyone to go out and read your incredible work.
Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.